In the previous video, we studied the Slutsky's equation. And what is Slutsky's equation? It simply states that price effect is equal to the sum of substitution and income effect. Now let us revisit the story that we have been working on, and that is price of an apple falls and all other variables like price of an orange and nominal income remain the same. Now we can break this down into substitution effect. And what is substitution effect? In this situation, apples have become relatively inexpensive and we keep the real income of this person the same. And in this case, the substitution effect will give us an unambiguous result, and that is an increase in consumption of apples. Now, when we have a situation like this, we also know there will be an increase in real income. And when we look at the income effect in this case, there are two possibilities. And so in the case of income effect, the result is not unambiguous. It all depends on what kind of a good we are looking at. If apples happen to be a normal good and real income increases, the income effect will be increase in consumption of apples. Now, what will be the total effect on consumption of apples in case of this situation? And that will be, if apples are normal, income effect will reinforce the substitution effect. And why do we say this? Because substitution effect tells us increase in consumption of apples, and if apples happen to be a normal good, income effect tells us increase in consumption of apples. So what will be the price effect in this case? It will be an increase in consumption of apples. Now let us see this in terms of a diagram when apples happen to be a normal good. So we already have this budget line 1, this one, budget line 1. And when price of an apple falls and everything else stays the same, we have this budget line BL3. And what we do, like we did in the case of breaking down price effect into substitution and income effect, we draw a budget line which is parallel to BL3 but is in tangent to the original indifference curve, which is IC1. So we have this budget line, this one, and we call this BL4. Let me just bring it here, BL4. Now we have equilibrium point E1 corresponding to budget line BL1. We have equilibrium point E3 corresponding to budget line BL3. And based on this diagram, we should be able to figure out what will be the substitution effect, and that will be captured by a movement from E1 to E4. And let me just type this out. Substitution effect will be equal A1 A4. And then we look at the income effect, which is a movement from E4 to E3. And since apples happen to be a normal good, we know when real income increases, there will be an increase in consumption of apples. For substitution effect, we already know there will be an increase in consumption of apples. And so what we find in this case is the income effect, if apples happen to be a normal good, reinforces the substitution effect. And so when we add these two up, we get the famous Slutsky's equation, which is price effect equals A1 A3. So this diagram pertains to apples being a normal good. Now suppose apples are not normal or they are inferior, And what will be the income effect when real income increases? It will be decrease in consumption of apples. Now, if apples are inferior, nothing happens to the substitution effect. There the results stay the same. That is, when apples become relatively inexpensive, substitution effect tells us there'll be an increase in consumption of apples. But what about income effect? Now, income effect will work opposite to the substitution effect. Now, what will be the impact on apples in terms of a price effect? We cannot predict this on a priori basis. So now let us look at all three possibilities when we are looking at apples being an inferior good. If one possibility is, if in terms of absolute value, substitution effect outweighs the income effect. And what is substitution effect? Increase in consumption of apples. What is income effect? Decrease in consumption of apples. And if substitution effect outweighs the income effect, what will happen to consumption of apples? Overall price effect, there will be an increase in consumption of apples. Another thing to consider is, what will Marshallian or ordinary demand curve look like when apples happen to be normal? In that case, it will be downward sloping. What about if apples are inferior but substitution effect outweighs the income effect in an absolute terms? The demand curves will still be downward sloping. So the Marshallian or ordinary demand curve in this case will be downward slope. Once again, we look at a similar diagram, but in this case now apples happen to be inferior. Let me just write this down, inferior. And the case we are examining is, in an absolute sense, the substitution effect outweighs the income effect when apples happen to be an inferior good. Now, look at the substitution effect. It is still reflected by this movement from E1 to E4. What is the impact on consumption of apples because of substitution effect? It is to increase consumption of apples. And what about the income effect? Income effect will be this movement from E4 to E3, and you'll find a decrease in consumption of apples because of income effect. What will be the overall price effect? It will still be A1, A3, and what you find here is, in this case, where substitution effect outweighs the income effect in case of apples being an inferior good, the result is price effect will also indicate an increase in consumption of apples. Now look at another possibility when apples happen to be an inferior good, and in this case one possibility is substitution effect equals income effect. We know in case of inferior good, substitution effect and income effect will act in opposite direction, but if these two are equal, then they'll cancel out each other, or price effect will be what? No change in consumption of apples. Now in this case, what will an ordinary or Marshallian demand curve look like when we are looking at an inferior good and the substitution effect cancels out the income effect? In this case, the ordinary demand curve will be vertical. Now look at another possibility, that is, in terms of absolute value, substitution effect is smaller than the income effect, or in other words, the income effect outweighs the substitution effect. So what will be the overall price effect? It will be to decrease consumption of apples. What will the Marshallian and ordinary demand curve look like in this case? It will be upward sloping. So like in my intro level class on demand, I had shown you demand curve could be downward sloping, vertical, horizontal, or upward sloping, and this happens to be a rigorous proof as to why that may happen. Now again we have a similar diagram that we have been looking at, or I have looked at earlier. We still have BL1, we have BL3, we have BL4, and what we are looking at is a case once again of an inferior good. And in this case, what we are looking at in an absolute terms of absolute value, the substitution effect is outweighed by income effect. And this is what this diagram shows. When we look at the substitution effect, we know it's a movement from E1 to E4. And what will happen to consumption of apples? They will increase. And then we have the income effect, and that will be reflected through movement from E4 to E3. What happens to consumption of apples because of income effect? It falls, and here you can see the increase in consumption of apples because of substitution effect is smaller than the decrease in consumption of apples due to income effect. So what will be the overall price effect? It will be to decrease consumption of apples. And what is the price effect? It is A1, A3, or the sum of substitution and income effects. Now the last slide that we examined is an example of Marshallian demand curve being upward sloping, and in an absolute terms of absolute value, the substitution effect is smaller than the income effect. If this happens, apples would be considered a Giffen good, and here is the definition of a Giffen good. Giffen good is an inferior good where in terms of absolute value, substitution effect is less than income effect, or the Marshallian or ordinary demand curve is upward sloping. Now, two things that we should remember about these different demand curves. Now, as far as the Marshallian or ordinary demand curve, this we know is based on price effect, which is made up of substitution and income effect, and this type of demand curve could be upward or downward sloping, or can also be vertical. As far as compensated demand curve goes, this is purely based on substitution effect, where we have removed the income effect, and for substitution effect we have an unambiguous result, and so this curve will always be downward sloping.